আমার পুরনো দিনের বন্ধু ডক্টর কুদরতে খুদা, তার কল্যাণ এখানে বলার সুযোগ পেলাম। সেই সূত্রে এখানে সামনের সারিতে যারা বসেছেন অনেকেই আমার বন্ধু, অনেক সাথে আগে পরিচয় আছে। আর যারা নতুন, যাদের সাথে পরিচিত হবার সুযোগ দান করলেন আপনারা, সেজন্য প্রথমেই আপনাদের ভুলে যাওয়ার আগে কৃতজ্ঞতা শুকরিয়া জানাচ্ছি। যে বিরাট একটা আমরা শিরোনামে বক্তৃতার বিষয় নির্ধারণ করেছি, তো শিক্ষার্থীর নানান রকম উপাদান আছে। আমি কয়েকদিন আগে পড়ছিলাম রনে দেকার্তের বই ডিসকোর্স অন মেথড, যেটা বলে সেখানে বলতে কোনো বিষয় নিয়ে যখন কথা বলবেন আগে তাকে শত ক্ষুদ্র খণ্ডে বিভক্ত করবেন। তার মধ্যে সবচেয়ে সহজ যেটা সেটা দিয়ে আগে শুরু করবেন, তারপরে আস্তে আস্তে জটিলের দিকে যাবেন। কোনো কিছু বাদ দেবেন না এবং কোনো কিছুকে শতকরা 100% নিশ্চিত হওয়ার আগে সত্য বলে স্বীকার করবেন না। এই 4টা পদ্ধতির কথা উনি বলেছেন। কোন দেশে যখন আইনের মাত্রা পরিমাণ বেশি হতে থাকে তখন বুঝতে পারেন সে দেশে সুশাসনের অভাব ঘটেছে। আমাদের দেশে যে কত আইন আছে, বাংলাদেশ কোড বলে একটা বই আছে, সেখানে যারা আইন শাস্ত্রে পাঠ করেছেন, আমারও জীবনে কিছুটা সৌভাগ্য হয়েছিল বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে আইন পড়ার, সেটার কোনো ইয়ত্তা নেই। প্রতিদিন আইন হচ্ছে। তো লেখাপড়ার ক্ষেত্রেও শত শত আইন আছে। আমি একটু সহজ আইনের কথাই বললাম। কোন বিষয়ে সম্পূর্ণ নিশ্চিত হওয়ার আগে সেটা নিয়ে না বলার চেষ্টা করা। 2 নম্বর হচ্ছে তাকে সহজ উপাদানে বিভক্ত করা এবং সেগুলি কেমন ভাবে সাজানো, প্রাকৃতিক না হলেও সহজ থেকে অপেক্ষাকৃত কঠিনে যাওয়া, এবং সবশেষে কোনো কিছুকে বাদ না দেওয়া। আমরা যে অনেকগুলো শব্দ ব্যবহার করেছি এখানে, সেগুলির থেকে আমি শুরু করব। তো কিভাবে শুরু করা যায়? যেহেতু আগেই আছে এখানে ডেভেলপমেন্ট, সেটা আমি পরে আলোচনা করব। আর আমার কথার মধ্যে আছে হিউম্যান রাইটস, ডেভেলপমেন্ট আর রুল অফ ল। এখন যে হিউম্যান রাইটস এর এত বেশি প্রভাব প্রসার হয়েছে, সকলে এখন আমরা হিউম্যান রাইটস এর কথা বলি। তো সেটা দিয়ে শুরু করি। আপনারা সকলে জানেন এমন কথাগুলি শুধু আমি আলোচনা করবো, নতুন কিছু নয়। তবে যেহেতু অনেক কথা জানলে আমাদের মনে থাকে না, আপনারা লক্ষ্য করেন এখন যে তর্কটা চলছে হিউম্যান রাইটস নিয়ে, হিউম্যান রাইটস এর বয়স কত? সকলে জানে যে 1948 সন থেকে হিউম্যান রাইটস এর আলোচনা শুরু হয়েছে। আলোচনাকে ইংরেজিতে ডিসকোর্স বলে। এখন আমি নতুন কিছু বলবো, এখানে নতুন কিছু বলার নাই। আমি শুধু আপনাদের বলি হিউম্যান রাইটস শুধু ডিসকোর্স নয়, ইংরেজিতে একটা আইডিওলজি বলে একটা আইডিওলজিও বটে। আরেকটা তত্ত্ব হচ্ছে এটার সূত্রপাত ঠিক 1948 সনে নয়, এটা সূত্রপাত কোথায়? 1789 সনে ইউরোপে বিপ্লবের সময়। ইউরোপে একটা বিপ্লব হয় নাই, আমরা একটা উদাহরণস্বরূপ বলছি ফরাসি বিপ্লবের সময়। আর কেউ কেউ বলেন যে না, বেদে, পুরাণে, কোরআনে, বাইবেলে সব জায়গায় তো হিউম্যান রাইটস এর কথা আছে। সেখান থেকে ধীরে 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 মানব জাতির বিবর্তনের শেষ স্তরে এসে আমরা হিউম্যান রাইটস এসে পৌঁছেছি। এরপর আর কি আছে বলার কিছু নাই। এটা একটা টেলিওলজি। তো এর মধ্যে কথা বলার জন্য কোথা থেকে শুরু করবো আমি কিছু স্থির করতে পারছিলাম না। তো পরে একটা পথ পেলাম, সেটি আপনাদের সাথে আমি ভাগ করতে চাই। এটা হচ্ছে আমেরিকান অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিক্যাল অ্যাসোসিয়েশন। 1948 সনে যুক্তরাষ্ট্রে যখন এলেনর রুজভেল্টের নেতৃত্বে কমিশন হলো যে হিউম্যান রাইটস ডিক্লারেশন জাতিসংঘ তৈরি করবে, যেটা পরবর্তীকালে ইউনিভার্সাল ডিক্লারেশন হয়েছে, সেইটার সময় তিনি যে পরামর্শ যাদের নিচ্ছিলেন তার মধ্যে একটা সংস্থা ছিল আমেরিকান অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিক্যাল অ্যাসোসিয়েশন। আপনারা অনেকে এটার সাথে পরিচিত, কেউ কেউ অপরিচিত থাকতে পারেন। 1947 সনের জুন মাসে আমেরিকান অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিক্যাল অ্যাসোসিয়েশন একটা সিদ্ধান্তে পৌঁছে, এটার নাম ছিল স্টেট ম্যাস। আমি সেটার কিছু কিছু অংশ আপনাদের পড়ে শোনাই। তাহলে আমার বক্তব্যের সার কথাটা বলি। এই হিউম্যান রাইটস কথাটা কোথা থেকে এলো? আগে যেটাকে বলা হতো ওয়ার্ডেন, অথবা ফ্রেঞ্চরা বলতো মিশিয়ন সিভিলাইজাত্রিস, সিভিলাইজিং মিশন। সেইটাই হিউম্যান রাইটস নাম ধারণ করেছে। কিভাবে ধারণ করলো? সেটা আমেরিকান অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিক্যাল অ্যাসোসিয়েশন 1947 সনে যে প্রস্তাব গ্রহণ করেছিল, সর্বসম্মত প্রস্তাব, সেটাতেই এই কথা লেখা আছে। মানে হচ্ছে উপনিবেশবাদের অবসানে তারা বুঝতে পারলো যে এখন নতুন দেশগুলো স্বাধীন হবে, তাদেরকে আর সিভিলাইজিং মিশনের মধ্যে বন্দি রাখা যাবে না। তাদেরকে আর বলা যাবে না যে, কিছুদিন আগেও তারা বলছে হোয়াইট ম্যানস বার্ডেন, তাদেরকে নিয়ন্ত্রণ করবার জন্য। কারণ তখন নতুন স্লোগান হলো প্রথম মহাযুদ্ধের পর থেকে, রাইট অফ নেশনস টু সেলফ ডিটারমিনেশন। এমনকি জাতিসংঘ যে কনভেনশন গুলো গ্রহণ করেছে সর্বশেষ, 1948 সনের ডেক্লারেশনের পরে দুটো কনভেনশন 1966 সনে গৃহীত হয়েছে, সিভিল এন্ড পলিটিক্যাল রাইটস এবং কালচারাল, ইকোনমিক এন্ড সোশ্যাল রাইটস। এই দুটো কার্যকর হয়েছে 1976 সন থেকে। এই ইতিহাসগুলো আপনারা জানেন। সেই কার্যকরের মধ্যেও অনেকে রেটিফিকেশন করে না, যেমন মার্কিন যুক্তরাষ্ট্র করেননি। তো এই দলিলগুলোর মধ্যেই আমি আলোচনা সীমিত রাখবো না, কিন্তু সেগুলোর আগে কি আলোচনা হয়েছিল সেটাই শুধু বলছি। এগুলোর মানে ছিল, আর এই দুটো কনভেনশন দ্বারা 1966 সনে তাতেও লেখা আছে মূলনীতি কি, রাইট অফ নেশনস টু সেলফ ডিটারমিনেশন। সেইটাকে অতিক্রম করার জন্য বলা হচ্ছে এখন রাইট অফ দি ইন্ডিভিজুয়ালস এগেইনস্ট দেয়ার ওন স্টেটস। এইটাই হচ্ছে হিউম্যান রাইটস আইডিওলজির মূল কথা। তার মানে যেটাকে ইন্টারন্যাশনাল কমিউনিটি বলা হয়, যারা পছন্দ করে না তারা এটাকে ইম্পেরিয়ালিজম বলে। আমি দুটো কোনোটাই বললাম না। তখন তারা বলছে যে তোমাদের দেশে তোমরা নিজের নাগরিকদের অধিকার যে দিচ্ছ না, সেটা হস্তক্ষেপের অধিকার আমাদের দিতে হবে। এই টেনশনটাকে, আমি কোন একটা বিশেষকে আন্তর্জাতিক মতবাদ বলে বলছি না, এই টেনশনের মধ্যে শুরু হয়েছে। তখন প্রথম দিকে যে তর্কটা ছিল সেটা হচ্ছে, সারা পৃথিবীর জন্য একটাই কি আন্তর্জাতিক মাপকাঠি হতে পারে? ইউনিভার্সাল হিউম্যান রাইটস ডিক্লারেশনের গোটা তো ছিল। প্রথম থেকে আপনি দেখবেন আমেরিকান অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিক্যাল অ্যাসোসিয়েশনের ঘোষণা তো কোথাও লিখছে রাইটস অফ ম্যান, কোথাও লিখছে হিউম্যান রাইটস। তখনও ভাষাটা এখন স্থির হয়ে ওঠেনি। অথচ ফরাসি বিপ্লবের সময় যে ঘোষণা নেওয়া হয়েছিল সেটাই ছিল কি, রাইটস অফ ম্যান, ডিক্লারেশন অফ দ্য রাইটস অফ ম্যান এন্ড রাইটস অফ দ্য সিটিজেন। এখন সিটিজেনশিপ কোথায় যেন উদাও হয়ে গেল। যে আমার কথার মধ্যে আপনারা বুঝতে পারতেছেন, আমি প্রথমে আমার প্রস্তাব বললাম, the ideology of human rights is only a rejuvenated, redressed version of the ideology of white man's burden. আচ্ছা, এখন ডেভেলপমেন্ট জিনিসটা কি আমি যেটা বলে শুরু করব। তাদের মধ্যে বিবাহটা কখন হলো? এটা 1970-এর পরে হয়েছে বিয়ে, কিন্তু আপনি দেখবেন। কিন্তু আমি একটু আগে ফিরে যাচ্ছি। বাংলাদেশ যখন স্বাধীন হয়েছে তারপরে প্রফেসর কুদরতে কুদা আমার পরিচয় দিতে একটা মজার সুন্দর ফ্রয়েডিয়ান স্লিপ করেছেন, যে আমার বিএ পাশ 1971-এ নিয়ে গেছেন। 1971-এ আমি মেট্রিকও পাশ করিনি, আমি পাশ করেছি 78-এ। তো সেটা মাঝে মাঝে এরকম হয় মানুষের, এটা নাম হলো ফ্রয়েডিয়ান স্লিপ। একটা কথা বলতে গিয়ে আমি আরেকটা কথা বলি। নট 1971, আই গ্রাজুয়েটেড ইন 1978। তো 7 বছর কম নয়। তার মানে ইতিহাসও দেখবো যে গত 50 বছর 1972 থেকে যখন নিউ ইন্টারন্যাশনাল ইকোনমিক অর্ডারের দাবি উঠেছে, সেটা জাতিসংঘ শেষ পর্যন্ত প্রস্তাব আকারে পাশ করলো 1986-তে। ওর মাঝখানে স্ট্রাকচারাল অ্যাডজাস্টমেন্ট আসলো। ইতিহাসগুলো আপনারা সবাই মুখস্থই জানেন। তাতে দেখা যায় আস্তে আস্তে হিউম্যান রাইটস আইডিওলজি আকারিভাবে দেখা দিল। যাই হোক, আমি এখন ডেভেলপমেন্টের কথাই বলি। যেটাকে আমরা এখন ডেভেলপমেন্ট বলছি, ব্রিটিশ আমলে এটাকে ইমপ্রুভমেন্ট বলা হতো। এমন 1940 সনের আগে কখনো ডেভেলপমেন্ট কথাটা বলতো না। আমরা ডেভেলপমেন্ট কথাটা শুনেছি কিভাবে? দুই রকম অর্থ আছে ভাষায়, আর বহু অর্থ। একটা হচ্ছে কি, ডেভেলপমেন্ট অফ হিউম্যান হিস্ট্রি, এটা হলো আনফোল্ডিং, আনফার্লিং, যেটাকে আমরা বিকাশ বলতে পারি। কিন্তু ডেভেলপমেন্টের বাংলা অর্থ হয়েছে কি এখন? উন্নতি। উন্নতি মানে কি? উন্নতি। উত হচ্ছে ইংরেজি, যেটাকে আমরা প্রিপোজিশন আউট বলি, সেটাই। ইউরোপের যে কোনো ভাষা দেখবেন উত মানে ঘরে বের হয়ে যাওয়া। এটা সংস্কৃত উত, বাংলায় উত মানে উপরের দিকে নতি, আপনার বিপরীত কি? অবনতি, নিচের দিকে নতি। নতিটি কি আছে? এখন তার থেকে আরেকটা শব্দ বানিয়েছি আমরা এখন, উন্নয়ন। এটার তলে নতুন অর্থটা কি? দেখা যাবে কি, অন্যের সাহায্য ছাড়া, বাইরের ইন্টারভেনশন ছাড়া, সিভিলাইজিং মিশনের ছাড়া আপনার কোনো নড়াচড়ার ক্ষমতা নেই। আপনি নিজে নিজে কিছু করতে পারেন না। এর মধ্যে একটা প্যাসিভিটি আছে উন্নয়নের মধ্যে, লক্ষ্য করা যাবে আর কি। তো এই উন্নয়নটাকে আগে কি বলা হতো? এটা আমি বলবো, এটা সিম্পলি হচ্ছে বল প্রয়োগ। ইংরেজিতে বললে মনে হয় ভায়োলেন্স। ভায়োলেন্সের মধ্যে আরো একটা অর্থ নিহিত আছে। যারা একটু ফরাসি ভাষায় নবিশি করেন তারা জানেন, ফরাসি ভাষায় ভিওল মানে হচ্ছে হোয়াট ইজ কল্ড রেপ, ধর্ষণ। উন্নয়নের মধ্যে একটা ধর্ষণের ভাব আছে। ভায়োলেন্সের সহজ বাংলা হচ্ছে, অ্যাকচুয়ালি বলতে গেলে জার্মান ভাষা বলে গেবাল্ট, বাংলা বল প্রয়োগের সেন্সটা ওখানে কিছুটা লক্ষ্য আছে। এইটাকে আমি বলবো, আমার এখন আমার বক্তব্য যদি আপনাদের কাছে খোলাসা করে বলতে হয়, আপনাদের কাছে একটু প্রভোকেটিভ মনে হবে, কিন্তু আমি সহজ করে বলছি। আমার মতে হিউম্যান রাইটস হচ্ছে হোয়াইট ম্যানস বার্ডেন, তারই পরিবর্তিত নবসংস্করণ, পরিবর্তিত সংস্করণ, এবং অনেকটা ফয়েল পেপারে ঢাকা সংস্করণ। সেইটা বের করাই হচ্ছে আমাদের গবেষণার কাজ। 2 নম্বর হচ্ছে ডেভেলপমেন্ট ইজ সিম্পলি অ্যানাদার নেম অফ ভায়োলেন্স। এই দুটো বলার জন্য কি করবো, আমি দুটো দলিল থেকে কিছু অংশ পড়ে শোনাবো, ইংরেজিতে পড়বো। প্রথম দলিলটা হচ্ছে আমেরিকান অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিক্যাল অ্যাসোসিয়েশন। তারা 1947 যে প্রস্তাব গ্রহণ করেন, পরবর্তীকালে হিউম্যান রাইটস আইডিওলজির বিশ্বজনীন প্রতিষ্ঠার আলোকে 1999 সনে আমেরিকান অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিক্যাল অ্যাসোসিয়েশন সেই প্রস্তাব বাতিল করে নতুন প্রস্তাব গ্রহণ করে, তাও কি ভোটাভুটির মাধ্যমে। মেজরিটি ভোটে একটা নতুন প্রস্তাব হইতে হয় না, উই আর অল না আইডিওলজিস্ট অফ হিউম্যান রাইটস। 2020 সনে সেটা আবার রিআইটারেট করেছে। তাহলে এই তিনটা দলিলকে নিয়ে যদি কেউ একটা সুন্দর আলোচনা করেন, চমৎকার একটা আলোচনা হয়। Human rights in the eyes of American Economic Association, in human rights in the eyes of American Anthropological Association, American Psychological Association, এরকম আলোচনা করা যাবে। আপাতত আমি সীমিত থাকি এখানে। আর ডেভেলপমেন্ট যে ভায়োলেন্স, আপনি বলেন আপনি এটা কোথায় পাইলেন, এটা আমি কোনো কিছু আবিষ্কার করি নাই, কিন্তু আমি আপনাদের সাথে আরেকটা লেখা কিছু অংশ পড়ে শোনাবো। এটা হচ্ছে সেই বিখ্যাত ফ্রান্স ফানো, যার রেচেড অফ দি আর্থ বই আপনারা পড়েন। 1960 সনের এপ্রিল মাসে তিনি ঘানাতে একটা বক্তৃতা দিয়েছিলেন। তখন ছিলেন আলজেরিয়ার অস্থায়ী বিপ্লবী সরকারের রাষ্ট্রদূত আকারে তিনি ঘানায় ছিলেন। সেখানে ডক্টর ক্রুমা হাজির ছিলেন। সেই বক্তৃতা এখনো পুরোপুরি ইংরেজি অনুবাদ হয়নি এবং ফরাসি টেক্সটও আমি খুঁজে পাইনি। আমি ইটালিয়ান থেকে অনুবাদ করেছি এটা, সেটার কিছু অংশ আপনাদের পড়ে শোনাবো। সেখানে দেখাচ্ছে হাউ ডেভেলপমেন্ট ইজ ভায়োলেন্স। আচ্ছা, আমেরিকান অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিস্টদের লেখাটা একটু দেখি এখন। সো আমি আই সুইচ টু ইংলিশ না, যেটা ইংরেজিতে লেখা। স্টেটমেন্ট অন হিউম্যান রাইটস, এটা প্রকাশ হয়েছিল আমেরিকান অ্যানথ্রোপোলজিস্ট পত্রিকায় 1947 সনের অক্টোবর-নভেম্বর সংখ্যায়। এটা হচ্ছে 49 বছরের 4th সংখ্যা, ভলিউম 49, নাম্বার 4। এটা যে স্টোরি পাওয়া যায় আপনারা দেখতে পারবেন। আমি একটু করে পড়ি, তারপরে আলোচনা আসবো। আপনাদের প্রশ্ন আমি নিতে পারবো মাঝখানে। আমার বক্তৃতার স্ট্রাকচার হচ্ছে এরকমই। এই দুটোর মধ্যে বিবাহটা কি হলো সেটা বলে শেষ করবো। The problem faced by the Commission on Human Rights of the United Nations in preparing its declaration on the rights of man, note the expression rights of man, yes, must be approached from 2 points of view. The first of which the declaration is ordinarily conceived concerns the respect for the personality of the individual and his right to its fullest development as a member of his society. এইখানে ডেভেলপমেন্ট শব্দটা সাধারণ অর্থটা আছে, ডেভেলপমেন্ট অফ এ পারসন। এখন রাষ্ট্র বা অর্থনীতিকে যদি আপনি একটা শিশু বলে কল্পনা করেন, তাহলে তার ডেভেলপমেন্ট স্টেজ থাকে, তাহলে তার একটা মৃত্যু থাকতে হবে, তখন কিন্তু আপনি মেটাফোর থেকে সরে যাবেন। তারপরে বলছেন, in a world order, however, respect for the cultures of differing human groups is equally important, according to American Anthropological Association. Marx হার্কোভিজ বলে এক ভদ্রলোক এটা ড্রাফট করেছিলেন। These are two facets of the same problem. Since it is a truism that groups are composed of individuals and human beings do not function outside the societies of which they form a part. The problem is thus to formulate a statement of human rights that will do more than just phrase respect for the individual as an individual. It must also take into full account the individual as a member of the social group of which he is a part. আপনারা হিয়ের সাথে শিও পড়তে পারেন, তখনকার ভাষা একটু পুরুষতান্ত্রিক ছিল। I think we can bear with that for a moment. তারপরে বলবেন, whose sanctioned modes of life shape his behavior and with whose fate his own is thus inextricably bound. Because of the great numbers of societies that are in intimate contact in the modern world, and because of the diversity of their ways of life, the primary task confronting those who would draw up a declaration on the rights of man, again repeated rights of man, is thus to resolve the following problem. Hold on. How can the proposed declaration be applicable to all human beings and not be a statement of rights conceived only in terms of the values prevalent in the countries of Western Europe and America? Question mark. Before we can cope with this problem, it will be necessary for us to outline some of the findings of the sciences that deal with the study of human culture that must be taken into account if the declaration is to be in accord with the present state of knowledge about man and his modes of life. If we begin, as we must, with the individual, we find that from the moment of his birth, not only his behavior, but his very thought, his hopes, aspirations, the moral values which direct his action and justify and give meaning to his life in his own eyes and in the eyes of those of his fellows, and shaped by the body of custom of the group of which he becomes a member. The process by means of which this is accomplished is so subtle and its effects are so far-reaching that only after considerable training we are conscious of it. Yet, if the essence of the declaration is to be, as it must, a statement in which the right of the individual to develop his personality to the fullest is to be stressed, then this must be based on a recognition of the fact that the personality of the individual can develop only in terms of his culture, the culture of his society, and so on. I will not go further into. Then they continue this way. The degree to which such evaluations evaluate in action depends on the basic sanctions in the thought of a people. In the main, people are willing to live and let live, exhibiting a tolerance for behavior of another group different than their own, especially where there is no conflict in the subsistence field. In the history of Western Europe and America, however, economic expansion, control of armaments, and an evangelical religious tradition have translated the recognition of cultural differences into a summons to action. This has been emphasized by philosophical systems that have stressed absolutes in the realm of values and ends. Definitions of freedom, concepts of the nature of human rights, and the like have thus been narrowly drawn. Alternatives have been decried and suppressed where controls have been established over non-European peoples. The hard core of similarities between cultures has consistently been overlooked. It is a bit surprising that at the end of the Second World War, American Anthropological Association has taken this position. Now this is more explosive. The consequences of this point of view has been disastrous for mankind. Doctrines of quote-unquote white man's burden have been employed to implement economic exploitation. This has been now renamed as development. I insert. And to deny the right to control of their own affairs to millions of peoples over the world, where the expansion of Europe and America has not meant the literal extermination of the whole populations. The sentence is a little bit convoluted, my friends. With an apology, let me make a remark here. This usual European expansion has led to the extinction of the whole populations, as in America, Canada, and many other places, Australia and New Zealand, not to name other places. But in those places like ours, or the Arab world, where it did not result in complete extinction of the population, there it has resulted in partial control. Let me read again. To deny the right to control their own affairs to millions of people over the world, especially where the expansion of Europe and America has not meant the literal extermination of the whole populations. So rationalized in terms of ascribing cultural inferiority to these peoples, or in conceptions of their backwardness in development of their quote-unquote primitive mentality, that justified their being held in the tutelage of their superiors. The history of the expansion of the Western world has been marked by demoralization of human personality and the disintegration of human rights among the peoples over whom the hegemony has been established. Likewise now, the values of the ways of life of these peoples have been consistently misunderstood and decried. Religious beliefs that for untold ages have carried conviction and permitted adjustment to the universe have been attacked as superstitious, immoral, untrue. And since power carries its own conviction, this has furthered the process of demoralization began by economic exploitation and the loss of political autonomy. It is rather a mild expression, autonomy. Complete freedom has been lost. So the white man's burden, the civilizing mission, have been heavy indeed, but their weight has not been borne by those who frequently, in all honesty, have journeyed to the far places of the world to uplift those regarded by them as inferior. Next point. I will not go through the whole document. They summarize the findings in 3 points. I will only give you the headlines. Point 1. This is the level of existing knowledge in 1947. Summarizing the previous 50 years of research. Number 1. The individual realizes his personality through his culture. Hence, respect for individual differences entails a respect for cultural differences. This is the finding of American Anthropological Association. Number 2, I skip the elaboration. Number 2 is this: respect for differences between cultures is validated by the scientific fact that no technique of qualitatively evaluating cultures has been discovered so far. Qualitatively discovered has not been found. Number 3, standards and values are relative to the culture from which they derive, so that any attempt to formulate postulates that grow out of the beliefs or moral codes of one culture must to that extent detract from the applicability of any declaration of human rights to mankind as a whole. Now they revert to the expression human rights, which will be accepted. So, give some examples. People have often decried this document as saying that this American Anthropological Association's debate on universalism versus relativism. So the 1999 correction, a one-page document, it has tried to put it back on its feet by saying that now we believe in universal human rights. How this has come about, we have to investigate that. And investigation will show that the foundations have not changed at all. The minor aspects have changed. What has happened? In the course of the 50 years of development from the 1948 to 1999, what we see is that there is a gradual expansion of recognition of different kind of rights as human rights. One problem that will immediately draw your attention is that there is no limit to the number of human rights. You can always enumerate such and such that is human rights. But in the beginning, there were some contradictions. One contradiction, just provocative, mentioned by American Association is this: what is held to be a human right in one society may be regarded as antisocial by another people or by the same people in a different period of history. Later on, Louis Hankin, a big human rights lawyer, sometimes professor of Columbia University, he cited an example. The American Senate would not ratify the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights because it compromises their right to propagate for war. Article 20 of that famous Civil and Political Convention, Civil and Political Rights International Convention, ICCPR, it says that racial propaganda or propaganda for war has to be discouraged. Americans would be accepting it only putting this article under reservation. So, but they would not give up their right to hang children, kill children or pregnant women, because these are part of the American constitutional law. That's what they claim. So if you go through all the developments, which I'm not going through right now, maybe in a discussion round we can come back to that. So I will now return to how this is married to development. We have to understand what development is. Development, according to these Europeans, is that there was no development, for example, according to this, before the British came to India or the French went to Algeria, to take two examples. Or Europeans went to America or Australia, there was no development. As if life was stopped there. In fact, they say their evolution stopped. So this is, of course, a truncated view. This is a distorted view. This cannot be the right view. So I will share with you a short writing, which I am now translating, of Franz Fanon. In this lecture, he kind of gave a presentation of this value. according to the established tradition that we are teaching, as if development regime began in 1945 or after 45, after the Second World War, because the word development is now being used after 1945. But when you ask them, they say, yes, ever since we reached India, then development regime began. The word they were using was improvement and many other words. Let me give you one example. Until 1914, the British regime in India did not know that they would be leaving India by 1945. In fact, Lord Curzon, who was Governor General and Viceroy around the year 1900, he imagined that India, in his opinion, jewel in the crown, the heart of their empire from the Middle East to Hong Kong, or from East Africa to the northern passes of Burma, if Britain would become immediately a third-rate empire, third-rate power if they lose India. So they said they will be lasting here for more than 500 years. But by 1914, they were thinking of leaving it. We'll see why. Lord Hardinge, in whose name Hardinge Bridge on 1.1 kilometer on Padda, and they were advertising it. If the English does not stay in India any longer, who will build this Hardinge Bridge? You will see a strange repetition of that argument in our contemporary history as well. Only the bridge is longer, nothing more than that. So anyway, in 1915, Hardinge launched this Hardinge Bridge, said that, he said, their contemporary advertisements in Bengali newspapers like that. ভারতের হিন্দু এবং মুসলমান প্রতিক্রিয়াশীল এবং সন্ত্রাসীগণ সাবধান, ইংরেজ শাসন না থাকলে হার্ডিঞ্জ ব্রিজ হবে না। কাজে ভারতে উন্নতির স্বার্থে ইংরেজের থাকা উচিত। But in Bengali they were using the word unnati, though in English it did not yet become the commonplace parlance. So anyway, what I'm now reading is a little bit convoluted. It's my own translation from Italian, so it's a little bit in draft form. Let me tell you the context. Franz Pann was speaking on April 7, 1960, in the session. It was called, the conference was called, let me read it, Conference for Peace and Security in Africa, held in Accra, 7 to 10 April. He said, Mr. Prime Minister, the name, by the way, of the speech is Why We Use Violence. He was representing Algerian Revolution, which was ongoing then. It was the 6th or 7th year of that revolution. Mr. Prime Minister, honorable delegates, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Africans, Fanustrics, the great speech delivered by our honorable previous speaker, Dr. Nkrumah, made a deep and lasting impression on me. I think that all the concerns that preoccupy Africa today were addressed with authority, with clairvoyance, in Dr. Nkrumah's speech. Today, I would like here to communicate to you the observations suggested by certain passages in the Prime Minister's speech. The problem of violence and racism in African states will be the questions I would like to fraternally discuss with you today. I don't intend to proceed, as you know, with a critique of the colonial system. I, being a colonized man myself, in speaking to the other colonized or formerly colonized man, don't intend to demonstrate that the colonial state is an abnormal, inhuman, and condemnable state. It will be grotesque of me to try to convince you of the unacceptable nature of colonial oppression. The colonial regime is a regime established with violence, but they call it development. It is always by force that the colonial regime was established. It is against the will of the people that other peoples who are more advanced in the technology of destruction or numerically more powerful have imposed themselves. I say that such a system established with violence can logically only be faithful to itself, and that its duration over time is a function of the maintenance of violence. The violence we are talking about is not an abstract violence. It is not only a violence elaborated by the mind. It is also a violence in the daily behavior of the colonizer towards the colonized. Apartheid in South Africa, forced labor in Angola, racism in Algeria, content, hate politics. These are the manifestations of a very concrete and very painful violence. Colonialism, however, is not satisfied with this violence towards the present. The colonized people are ideologically presented as a people who have stopped in their evolution. So they need development. Who are impervious to reason, so they need enlightenment. Incapable of directing their own affairs. Who require the constant presence of protection and direction. These are things called development. The history of the colonized peoples is transformed into agitation devoid of any meaning, demanding freedom for autonomy. As late as the 1890s, some leaders of Indian National Congress were raising the question of distant possibility of India one day becoming a dominion. So the then Governor General says that this is completely unacceptable. Then he took it as sedition. Those Congress leaders included Surendranath Banerjee and others, Dadabhai Naoroji and others. So let me return to this. The history of the colonized peoples is transformed into agitation devoid of any meaning. And in fact, one gets the impression that humanity for these peoples begins with the arrival of the brave colonists. To this day, I am trying to argue against the grain. Many will not agree with me because people nowadays think that development as freedom. Amartya Sen's famous book, which is one of your latest books, I would say development as violence. But why he is renaming violence as freedom? That is the question we have to. And you will see. I have my reasons. You do not have to necessarily agree with me. My job is only to make you think and give you a kind of a point for beating. So, Fanon says here, what I say here is of capital importance for the history of errors that can upset human reason. Violence in daily behavior, violence towards a past that is emptied of any substance, violence towards the future, since the colonial regime considers itself eternal. Colonialism does not rob you of your present only, it robs you of your past. In India, they were the ones who said that the middle times in India is Muslim period. So the previous time was Hindu period. And now the British has come. They don't call themselves Christians. The British has come to restore the glorious Hindu past. They were the ones who instigated Shivaji Utsav, Ganapati Utsav, or even in Bengal, it is a consensus argument, they encourage the worship of the goddess Durga. Or if that is controversial, let me go to Cow Protection Society. Things move that way. Colonialism works to rob you not only of your present but also of your past. They give you a different history. Instead of a composite culture that we built up, they said that this is a foreign culture. And we'll find this. Violence in daily behavior, violence towards the past, that is emptied of any substance. Violence towards the future, since the colonial regime considers itself eternal. We see that. The colonized people caught in the network of three-dimensional violence, a meeting point of multiple, diversified, reiterated, cumulative violence, arrives quite quickly to logically pose the problem of an end to the colonial regime by any means. By any means necessary. This is what they call violence now. Now, entire colonial regime is based on the premise of violence, but any opposition to them is immediately identified during the British period as terrorism. And nowadays this is called militancy and other words. So Fanon continues. This violence of the colonial regime is not only experienced on the level of the soul, but also on that of the muscles, on that of the blood. This violence that wants to be violent, which becomes more and more disproportionate, immediately causes the birth of an internal violence within the colonized people, and a righteous anger arises and tries to express itself. A philosopher as good as Hannah Arendt attacks Jean-Paul Sartre and Frantz Fanon on this point, say that you are inciting violence. But Fano is insisting, saying that no, it is a legitimate and righteous response to the violence that has perpetrated itself for hundreds of years. We are trying to only get rid of that violence. Now here comes the time of Mahatma Gandhi. I will speak about it. Why Mahatma Gandhi had to make an ideology of non-violence? Because he thought that face-to-face British violence, it was impossible for Indians to gain their independence. So he devised a very, I would say, a shrewd ideology. And he will also say the same thing when the demand was being raised by Indian National Congress itself, by men like Dadabhai Nauroji, Ramesh Chandra Datta, or an Englishman, William Digby, or in Maharashtra, Mahadev Govind Ranade, or Gopal Krishna Gokhale, then Mahatma Gandhi said that no, we do not need industrialization. One of the demands was that what India needs is industrialization to create jobs and to elevate the standard of the people's living standard. Now the confusion ideologically is that you might attack me saying that, are you opposing development? I'm not opposing the raising of living standards. Development should be raising of living standards. Nowadays our definition of economic development is per capita income. But everybody, even a child, should understand that per capita GDP will not let you pass through the river. You will not be able to pass through the Suez. You need the lowest common denominator. The lowest income should be the standard of, let's say, development. But nobody, neither the World Bank nor UNDP, which has adopted Amartya Sen's ideology, for example, but they do not consider the minimum wage as the standard of development, as the measure of development. They take the average. Average is per capita. Whatever it is, maybe media, they do not even take the modal income. They take only the mean income, which is called the per capita income. Just divide income by the number of population, and what gives you is the mean. But if you took the majority of the people, let's say 95% of the people live with a similar bracket, that is the modal income. If you take the modal average, that would also be even a better measure. But anyway, this is the proof of intellectual violence. And you see, Amnesty International got the Nobel Prize in 1977. How human ideology has become now the worldwide ideology. And also people get the Nobel Prize in peace, in economics. These are directly ideological crises. You will see this. The role of the political party that takes control of the destinies of these people is to stem this violence. We do not want violence, but we cannot tackle violence with violence. We understand it, not only Mahatma Gandhi, even Frantz Fanon, who is often vilified as a prophet of violence. Maulana Bhashani was also sometimes vilified as prophet of violence, you know, Red Maulana. But it is not their true position. It is a misrepresentative position. Take a look, get it from the horse's mouth. Frantz Fanon speaking in 1960, only 1 year before his death, he is saying this: the role of the political party that takes control of the destinies of these people is to stem this violence. And natural violence, a tendency, anger grows up among the people. But how do you channelize this? To channel it by ensuring it a peaceful platform and a constructive terrain. Since for the human mind that contemplates the unfolding of history, this is the true meaning of the word development, unfolding of history, and that tries to remain on the terrain of the universal. I am no buyer of the American Anthropological Association's ticket, which I have actually read out before you. We have to attain universal status. That remains the goal. There is only one standard, universal. But what are the steps that we must cross? That is the question I am trying to raise. Violence must, first of all, be fought with the language of truth and reason. I know you will say these are contentious terms themselves. What is truth? What is reason? I will say human rights, from this point of view, is an ideology of what Jean-Paul Sartre has called in being and nothingness. Bad faith. Mauvaise foi. What is bad faith? When you yourself do not believe in it, but you want to sell it. The shortest definition in the dictionary is that inauthentic ideology. People have written MPhil and PhD thesis, numerous of them, on the idea of bad faith within what is called existentialist philosophy. I am just saying development is violence, and so-called human rights as ideology is bad faith. Let me proceed a little bit more. But it happens, unfortunately. And there cannot be man who do not deplore this historical necessity. It happens. I say that in certain enslaved regions, the violence of the colonized becomes a pure and simple manifestation of his specifically animal existence. When people are pushed down to bare level of animal existence, maybe called, you are just a bare life, homo sacer, sacred life. Then what happens? It is regrettable that people in their self-defense, now self-defense is an ideology acceptable for Israel, not for the Palestinians. So in this kind of unequal look, if I invoke you the experience of the Algerian Revolution, which was an anti-colonial revolution, it says that this, I read again, I say animal and I speak as a biologist. In Italian, as a biolog. What says? Since such reactions are nothing else, in short, than defense reactions that express a completely banal instinct of conservation. আত্মরক্ষার মানুষের শেষ চেষ্টা। So what has happened? আপনি একজনকে হান্ট করা শুরু করেছেন, সে দাঁড়িয়ে তখন বলছে এখন আমি I have no way to escape your hunt. And the invaluable achievement of the Algerian Revolution is precisely that. It is a grandiose outcome and caused a change in the instinct of conservation into value and truth. This is Fanu's evaluation. For the Algerian people, the only solution was this heroic struggle at the heart of which they had to crystallize their national consciousness and deepen their quality as African people. And no one will be able to deny that all these blood shed in Algeria will ultimately not serve as leaven for the great African nation. Fanu was trying to address the Africans there. He was ambassador at large for African countries located in Ghana. Then only recently became independent. As you know, in 1957, Ghana became independent. So, in certain colonies, Fanu continues, the violence of the colonized is the final gesture made by the hunted man when he thus wants to indicate that he is ready to defend his life. There are colonies that fight for freedom, for independence, for the right to happiness. In 1954, the Algerian people took up arms because the colonialist prison was becoming so oppressive that it was no longer bearable. That the hunt for Algerians in the streets and countryside was definitively turned on, and because finally for the Algerian people it was no longer a question of giving meaning to his life, but of giving one to his death. Sometimes we ask, what are you going to do with your life? তুমি বড় হলে কি করবে? প্যালেস্টাইনের শিশুরা বলে, আমরা তো বড় হই না। This is a graphic expression of that situation. What is to be done with my life? বঙ্কিমচন্দ্রের উপন্যাসে আছে, আপনারা দেখবেন আনন্দ মঠে, বলছে যে তোমার পণ কি? বলে আমার পণ জীবন সর্বস্ব। আরেকটা দৃষ্টান্ত আছে, আমার পণ প্রাণ সর্বস্ব। তো বলছে জীবন প্রাণ শুধু তুচ্ছ, আর কি আছে, আর কার দিব? তখন উত্তর হইল ভক্তি। এই হচ্ছে ভক্তির উত্তর। So now what happens in a colonial situation? ভারতের ইতিহাস যদি আপনারা পর্যালোচনা করেন, both in terms of so-called economic development and both in terms of human rights, যেটা তারা দাবি করবে যে ভারতে এসে তারা এই জন্য রুল অফ ল প্রতিষ্ঠা করেছে। তো হোয়াট ওয়াজ দ্য নেচার অফ দ্য রুল অফ ল? বেশি পড়ার দরকার নেই, আপনার লয়ের সময় তো আমার থাকবে না, তবু আমি তো ইঙ্গিত দিয়ে রাখি। আলজেরিয়াতে কি হচ্ছে এটা পড়লে কিছুটা বোঝা যাবে। এটা বলে দে তে ফাবুলা নারাতুর, এটা ল্যাটিন প্রভাব, তোমার গল্প বলা হয়েছে। Your fable is already narrated. We learned from the press and the radio that, Fanu writes, in Kenya, a European recently was sentenced to death for killing an African. Well, in Algeria, this is impossible. Indeed, I think that they would congratulate such a European and that he would be given the medal of pacification. You know, development has another name. Rule of law has another name in our countries called pacification or counter-insurgency. Jongi Birodhi Abhijan, that is what we call nowadays. So, Fanu says, in Kenya recently someone has been sentenced to death, which was the British colony. He says that we read 14 days ago only, before this, in April. He says, but in Algeria, we cannot conceive it. Now let me give you a footnote here, or you might call it a side note. Albert Camus, who was awarded the Nobel Prize recently then in 1957, he published a novel in 1942 called The Outsider, L'Étranger. Outsider is the famous English title of The Stranger. There, the story that he narrates is that an European man, Merceau, killed an Arab. That's why he was sentenced to death. And that is the whole. It was in the city of Oran, where there was a big plague once upon a time. Plague was also based on that city in Algeria. As you know, Albert Camus was an Algerian. There are many Algerians. Jacques Derrida was an Algerian. Louis Althusser was an Algerian. So, Algeria and France is a complicated relationship. Here is my question. There was no European put to death in Algeria. In that sense, it is in that sense I say that any novel of Sayyid Shamsul Haq is a lie. I know fictions are fictions. They are necessarily not factual discussions. But when it is based on nothing that you know, you completely reduce the entire war of liberation into a series of rapes. And then it is an untrue representation. It is in that sense that I said, no novel of Sayyid Shamsul Haq written about the war of liberation of Bangladesh in 1971 is true. It is in that sense that Albert Camus' novel, despite its high artistic qualities, is an untrue novel, historically speaking. Because no European was ever punished. Forget about death punishment, was ever punished with any serious punishment in that country. Here is the story. The million Europeans in Algeria pose particular problems. White people in Algeria are afraid of the Algerian nation. Physical fear, moral fear. And this dual fear is expressed with aggressiveness and highly homicidal behaviors. I could have translated this as murderous behavior. Translations, as you know, always involve choices. So, at the basis of this behavior, we find, first, a very intense guilt complex. Quote, if the Algerians, they say, were to rule Algeria one day, they would certainly do what we colonists did and make us pay for our crimes, unquote. Secondly, they say, there is also here a certain Manichaean conception of the world which would always be divided into oppressors and oppressed. There is a permanent element here. In India also, especially after 1857, the British and the Indians distanced themselves farther apart. Mem Sahibs started to arrive and they started to become feminine. They said, previously there are some examples of British men resident in India getting married to Indian women. Like William Dalrymple claims that one of his great-grandmothers were a Bengali woman. But this has become a reality after 1857. In Algeria, it was more so. So Fanou says that there is a racial distance. Sometimes you might say, what is racism? Let me remind you, my friends, the name of one man whom I don't like particularly. His name is Bal Gangadhar Tilak. In 1907, he was punished by the British. He was an agitator, one of the founders of the Gorakhani Samiti, Society for Cow Protection. He said that the justice, British justice, the rule of law, the third word in my presentation, he said that the God of justice is blind, as you all know. He is here, but he can see the difference between white and black. It's a peculiar kind of blindness. So, let me proceed. And it is here that I encounter the second point of my speech, which refers to racism in Africa. What happens? We, Africans, are not racist. And the Honorable Dr. Nkrumah is right when he says, quote, the concept of Africa for Africans does not mean that other races are excluded from it. It only means that the Africans who are naturally the majority in Africa will govern themselves. They will have to govern themselves in their countries. We are fighting for the future of humanity, and ours is one of the most important fights, unquote. This is quoted from Nkrumah's speech. Then Fanou comments, the colonizer in Algeria says that Algeria belongs to him. We Algerians say, all right, Algeria belongs to us all. Let us build it on democratic foundations, and together let us build an Algeria that measures up to our ambition and our love. Let me interpolate another comment here. Why do we need human rights to protect us? If we had democracy in the sense that they have democracy. If we have rule of law, human rights ideology would be redundant. So it is said that as if democracy is not possible for whatever mysterious reason, so we need human rights to give you. Because giving a human rights apparently looks like Antarjatik Matривasha Divas, as if it is a bolstering up, but actually it is a reduction in content. Reducing you to a human means what the Freudian slip of an Israeli minister last month uttered, said that these are human animals in Gaza. So human rights is nothing but human animals' right. You will see that. It defines that everybody needs a little bit of food. Even slaves also need the food. So if you say that a slave remains a human being in terms of food, but not in terms of his rights. So this reduction of fully free individual citizens into denizens and then into now netizens and into nothingness, that is what our human rights ideology is invariably leading to. It shudders me to see that not a single professor I find to criticize. I will come to the professors who are criticizing it, like Samuel Moyn. But their criticism is very subtle. You will see this. Let me finish this first. The colonizers then answer us that we want a modified Algeria, a reformed Algeria, that what they want is Algeria that eternally perpetuates the current state. Exactly, human rights ideology is a nice transition rubric through decolonization. You see, there is a strange coincidence between the rise of human rights ideology and the era of decolonization. And it cannot be coincidental. It is not, in fact. But very few people have really investigated it. When people like Amartya Sen redefines and tries to define this in terms of capability, it is only an intellectual, I would say, bad faith. I cannot believe that Amartya Sen doesn't understand it. If he does not understand it, then I would say he is mistaken. But when he understands and plays games with it, then I call it bad faith. And we'll see why I say so. So now here, he says that in reality, the colonizer does not live in Algeria. He reigns there. And any attempt to modify the colonial statute provokes highly murderous reaction in the colonizer. That is another story. I'll say, when Algeria was freed, there were more than 1 million Algerians. They were the Pieds Noirs, Blackfeet, literally, the settlers. Why all of them had to leave? And they demanded that they will not stay in Algeria. Many of them were in origin Italians, by the way. That I did not know in the beginning. Not all of them are French. There were many convicts. All of them left Africa, Algeria. The same story was also in Morocco, but I cannot repeat many examples. Entire Maghreb, Tunisia, Algeria, Maghreb, repeat the same story. This was there. They wanted to make it a settled colony. Only Israel so far has made it successfully in the modern world. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, USA, and many states in South America, countries that we now laud, Brazil, Argentina, everything is settled colony. Only India and, say, Arabia was our, at that time, trade colonies. So, here is their continuity. They will not stay in their trade colonies. They want a settled colony. They would push the original inhabitants, whom they now euphemistically call First Nations. They put them into reserves. This is happening before our eyes, but nobody talks about human rights there. They only use it in ideology. I will talk about it. It is 14 years since our dear brothers in South Africa demonstrated their opposition to the laws promulgated by the racist government of the Union. You know, Philip Bill, in Algeria also there were Setif and many other. In one day, on 8th of May 1945, people were agitating only for the release of certain political prisoners in Algeria. The Algerian Pieds Noirs or black settlers, natives and others opened fire. Their military and police. 45,000 people died according to the government statistics. And they were buried on the next day. 8th of May 1945. This is famous small city where people were demonstrating in Algeria, not far from Algiers, called Sétif. So referring to this, he's coming here. There were 200 deaths to count in South Africa. We mourn our brothers in South Africa. We criticize we condemn the South African government, and we say that this international moral pressure is a card of great importance in the struggle for African freedom. So, but on May 8th, 1945, almost 15 years ago, the Algerian people marched in principal cities of Algeria to demand the release of certain political prisoners and the implementation of human rights on the national territory. At the end of the day, 45,000 Algerian dead were buried. Now, if you search the internet, you will find that French historians say, no, the number is too inflated. It's 15,000. They are shameless. They think as if the number of killing were 15,000 is an acceptable number. And this Emmanuel Macron went to say, oh, the settlement in any colony is what you call crime against humanity. To win his election campaign, he said this in 2017. So those figures which jolt the conscience is officially confirmed by the government of the French Republic. To this day, not a French man were brought before a tribunal to answer for a single one of these 45,000 dead. This is France Canon 1960. You might say that probably I am betraying you a little bit. What I was supposed to talk about and what I am talking. I think your story is told here. I simply try to say that the present regimes, even if the killing is not done by white armies, we are continuing the same regime. Decolonization or independence or partition of the countries appear to be only a sham episode compared to the continuity. If you argue that, is there a continuity or a break? Is it an epistemological break? Is it a Kuhnian break or paradigm change? I beg to think that it is not so. So let me finish. What we are saying is that we need to close our ranks. It is that our voice must become powerful not only in tone but also in concrete measures that could be taken against this or that colonial state. But we have not been able so far. When we raised the question of new international economic order, it was washed with structural adjustment. When that failed, then they came with the idea of human rights. And tying it to the so-called your right to development. This is the third world economists were trying to formulate this in 1970s. Now it has become embedded in all documents like Bangladesh's Rashtrabhasha. Nobody is agitating now for including Bangladesh's Rashtrabhasha as Bangla, but where is Bangla in the country? But we think that it was a wrong decision. Rashtrabhasha should have been English, but we have not done it. But we are carrying on our business very well. Exactly the same thing is happening in the international sphere. Your right to development included a big human right. It was actually a part of right of self-determination. But human rights ideology was thrown in to negate the right of self-determination. Though even in the two famous conventions, they begin their premise with this. I will finish soon. Fellow Africans, may the day never dawn when we can see 45,000 African citizens wiped out in 24 hours by colonial barbarism. But we are calling it civilization. Civilization, barbarism, and savagery are considered to be three big steps of mankind's evolution. But what is the evolution? I don't see it. If you take kindness, tenderness, there has been no progress in human civilization. It remains in the same, I would say, savage state. For example, now it is enough for them to say, he is not human. And you have seen this in the recent history, in the history of Iraq, Afghanistan, or where not. So we really need to make the white colonizers and the nations that support them hesitate. In Angola, where 200,000 Portuguese rule by terror. In Rhodesia, where the monstrous face of racism shows off with an unparalleled violence. In Kenya, where our brave brother Jomo Kenyatta languishes in prison and where the colonizers do not despair of fighting a decisive and victorious battle. The colonizer, as is found in Algeria, in Angola, in Kenya, in Rhodesia, in the Union of South Africa, is obstinately opposed to any cuts in his supremacy. We don't tell the colonizer, you are a foreigner, go away. We don't tell him, we are going to take the charge of the country and make you pay for your crimes and for those of your ancestors. We don't tell him that we will confront the past hatred of the black with the present and future hatred of the white. No, we tell him, we are Algerians, let us banish all racism, all forms of oppression from our land, and let us work for man, for the affirmation of man, and for the enrichment of humanity. The colonizer then answers us, and the French government supports him. Algeria is French, l'Algérie française. In Angola, Angola is Portuguese. In the Union of South Africa, the Union of South Africa is a white state. So to the declaration of Farhat Abbas, the Algerian Prime Minister, in which he solemnly appealed to the Europeans of Algeria as Algerian citizens, a declaration, the high thoughts and moving terms of which struck the most French-leaning Western countries, General de Gaulle responded under the pressure of the colonizers and the army that it was necessary to destroy any idea of an Algerian nation. I'm drawing your attention to the parallelism of the ideology of human rights and this. Why? Ideology of human rights destroys any idea of self-determination. Now you might say, is it not a fact that human rights are being violated? True. But why can't we control this violation by ourselves? That remains the open question. So it happened this way. Instead of recognizing Algerian national sovereignty, France preferred to change its government 6 times and the republic once. They switched on the 5th Republic under de Gaulle. And the 5th Republic, put on its feet by General de Gaulle and counters, despite the atomic bomb detonated in the Algerian Sahara, more and more difficult moments ever due to the prolongation of the Algerian war is being faced. In our partisan military hospitals, the wounded Algerians taken prisoner by the French are very often savagely and cowardly slaughtered in their beds. We treat tortured Algerians, Algerian women who have gone mad after rape and torture. We bury dozens of Algerians shot in the back. And the brave Yugoslav people, alas, that Yugoslavia no more exists now, welcome amputated, dismembered, blinded Algerians at an accelerated pace. And I say that if anger does not drown someone who sees such things, it is because he lacks a human dimension. So on the other hand, it should be noted that it is first of all this anger, this immense repugnance for French atrocities which has directed the majority of Algerian Europeans, not only Algerians, who are members of the FLN today, towards our ranks. Sometimes they are the same children of policemen who have been haunted all night long by the screams of the tortured. It is, first of all, anger, holy anger, an anger that testifies to man, which led the Europeans to make the struggle of the Algerian people their own. And you understand now why some Christians, some priests are active within the FLN, Front Libération Nationale, National Liberation Front. Why today there are Europeans of Algeria, descendants of colonizers, who die facing French bullets in the ranks of the valiant National Liberation Army. And you now understand why Christians, priests, also militate within the FLN. Because today there are Algerian Europeans, descendants of the colonizers, in the ranks of the valiant National Liberation Army who die under French fire. It is that behind this anger, in contact with the extraordinarily accelerating message of the Algerian Revolution, Europeans discovered their love for the Algerian Revolution. Europeans discovered their love for the Algerian homeland and refined their national sense. Then Fanul continues, he says that, no, the armed violence of the Algerian people is not a hatred of peace, nor a rejection of human touch, nor the belief. Okay. So now we'll have to go for a question and answer session. I'm just finishing with this last paragraph. General de Gaulle says, we must crush the Algerian people. We reply to him, let us negotiate. Let us find a solution that measures up to the rise of contemporary history. But know that if you want to break the ranks of the Algerian people, it will be necessary for your armies to break themselves against the bulwark of the glorious soldiers of the Algerian army. So many Africans have died to defend the sovereignty of the European states that today it is worth it for Africans to agree to die for the freedom of Africa. This was, in essence, there is a little bit more of Panu's speech in 1960, which simply shows up that colonialism comes to the old colonies in the name of development, in the name of liberating them, in the name of elevating them from savagery and barbarism to the level of civilization. But what they give is this. Now when liberation became inevitable, some people might say, why did Britain leave India in 1947 so early? They originally gave a date to leave by 30 of June 1948, but they brought it forward about 10 months by. Why? There are reasons. And this reason is that a war of, say, Second World War not only weakened them, but they were afraid of upcoming revolts in India, symbolized by the Royal Indian Navy, RIN revolt in 1946 February. Similarly, Algerian War of Liberation was a lesson. France left Vietnam and they had to leave after 8 years, Algeria. From here we have this lesson, that the continuity of the colonial regime under the name of post-colonialism is underlying the ideology of both development and human rights. They are not opposed to each other. But when they have coupled themselves in the 1990s, say that all developments have to pass the test of being, say, observing human rights properly, is only a new repetition of what has always been there. Human rights have always been wedded to the ideology of development. If development is the violent phase, human rights is the ideological soft phase. Thank you. This is time for me to take questions and comments. Yeah.